And it was a very stimulating opening session. We have heard from our top experts in this field. Our last speaker, Professor Moon, really laid out the difficult strategic choices that lie ahead for Korea, and in part from the perspective of public diplomacy, it really lays out and maps out territories and roles that public diplomacy is also set to play in the world ahead. And now for our first session, we have a very special moderator joining us virtually from Japan, Professor Nancy Snow of Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. She has written various books on public diplomacy as well as propaganda. She has visited us a number of times. Professor Snow will be leading the session, Public Diplomacy in the COVID-19 World. It's great to see you this morning, Nancy. Are you there? There you go. Good morning. Good morning. You now have the screen and the mic.
Okay, thank you so much. Ohayo gozaimasu from Tokyo. I was delighted to hear Pax mentioned because I hold the title of Pax Mundi, World Peace Professor of Public Diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies. And to be in this region is very exciting. I really want to credit Korea, not only given the year that we're having, but its leadership, of course, with the management of the pandemic. In fact, I wanted to share a poll quote before we go into the presentations, and it's the following. From Nikkei Asia, just 2 days ago, with the headline, COVID pushes Asia to embrace big government. The big story conclusion from the magazine was this, quote, as the world tries to reimagine the state in the aftermath of COVID-19, it makes sense to look toward governments like South Korea and Taiwan, which have mixed high state capacity with plenty of technological innovation. So as much as we have these challenges on the table, we also have much promise, especially if we can emphasize more collaboration. And with that, I want to move quickly to our two presenters, followed by two discussants. Dr. Zaharna is in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to see her from American University. And also in Korea, we have Dr. Ihan, who is going to join us immediately following. They'll each have about 20 minutes to present, and then we will have the two discussants, Dr. Lee and Anna K. DuPont from the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, followed by what I hope will be about 20 minutes, if we can, for Q&A. So that's how I see this playing out. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Zaharna. And I'm going to now, there you go.
Yeah, let me unmute and let me set up here, okay?
Okay.
All right. Share. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Snow. 1 second. Let me see if I've got the video going. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. First, let me congratulate KAPD and wish it every success. And I thank you so much for the kind invitation to participate in this exciting conference. I was really inspired by KAPD's visionary title, An Age of Great Transformation. And if the world is being transformed by this virus, we can ask, what about public diplomacy? And to explore that question, I really want to divide my talk into 4 parts. The first is a brief look at public diplomacy, and I just want to highlight a few points. Then to look at the insights from the virus, what it's revealing about our world, and more importantly, about ourselves. Then to look at public diplomacy, how public diplomacy aligns with some of those insights. And then finally to return back to that question of great transformation. What are some of the lessons we can look at for how to transform public diplomacy? So let me start with where we were not too long ago. And this was Dr. Snow, our esteemed moderator, compiled the first handbook on public diplomacy with Phil Taylor. And in the opening essay, she laid out some of the dominant ideas that would shape public diplomacy post 9/11. First, she put public diplomacy as inevitably linked to power. Then public diplomacy was new at the time, and scholars were distinguishing it from traditional diplomacy. Whereas traditional diplomacy was government to government, public diplomacy would be government to the publics. She also put the trend of non-state actors, which at that time was very controversial. Because how could diplomacy be diplomacy if the actors were not tied to the government? She also highlighted some of the functions of public diplomacy to inform, influence, and engage publics. If we look, and we should congratulate a new version that has just come out, a new edition that's just come out, and she highlights the emergence of relationships and highlights a young Korean scholar in putting this in the relations. And then she is with a visionary view of public diplomacy. She asks, we need to find a larger meaning in what we do as public diplomacy scholars and practitioners. What is our mission? What is our collective goals greater than our individual selves? And how can we put the chaos of the modern world into a global context? And I want to come back to that later. But when you're looking at the traditional public diplomacy and aligning it with traditional diplomacy, and we see a parallel focus on the state and a highlighting of communication. And we see that in traditional diplomacy, there was reporting, representation, and negotiation. Call, in looking at public diplomacy, highlighted again a tie to the state and communication functions, listening, advocacy, international broadcasting, cultural diplomacy, and exchange diplomacy. Call also noted the importance of advocacy, and public diplomacy was a tool for promoting the needs, interests, and goals of the state in the public arena. Dr. Snow highlighted also the tying of public diplomacy to soft power. And many credit Nye's concept of soft power as fueling interests, global interests in public diplomacy. Nye singled out culture, values, and ideology as the nation's three soft power resources. This combination of these three spotlighted the phenomena of nation branding. Simon Holt, who was a vocal advocate of nation branding, fueled this competition with his global ranking. These were just some of the points I want to touch on about public diplomacy. Let us turn to insights from the virus. And I have on my screen a screenshot of the microbe, and my apologies, it's hard to see. The microbe's about 1/1000th of a size of a human hair. We can't see it, but it sure can find us. And if we understand public diplomacy as influencing the attitudes and behaviors of global publics, this tiny microbe has some powerful insights for us. So let's look at some of those insights. One is, over the last century, historians have noted one of the most prevalent trends is the growing global connectivity. We realize the extent of the global, of this connectivity, economic connectivity with the 2008 financial crisis. We embrace the digital connectivity with our technology that linked us to each other and now increasingly an Internet of Things. We know about the interconnectedness of the environment with monster hurricanes and droughts and fires that forced us from our homes. We're realizing the extent of political connectivity when turmoil in one country sends refugees to borders of another. A byproduct of all of this connectivity is the growing growth of wicked complex problems. We're used to tame problems. Tame problems have clear solutions. Countries use public diplomacy to solve tame problems. Japan would build Friendship Bridge, and this is in Bangladesh in 1991 that helped the villagers in Bangladesh. Today, Bangladesh is facing a far more complex, what we call wicked problems of rising sea levels. And these wicked problems are so complex they cannot be solved with the country's diplomacy or development aid. We look at the Ebola 2014 outbreak. It was a harbinger of the dynamic of connectivity that's propelling wicked problems. I was reading a piece by one of our discussants, Professor Anselmo Lee, about how the COVID pandemic is really much more than a narrow health crisis. It was tied to several environmental factors, and it represented, quote, a wake-up call for an imminent climate crisis. So while we may have been growing more aware of our connectivity politically, economically, environmentally, what we may have overlooked and what the virus has literally brought home is the extent of our human connectivity. One report by Refugee International says the scale and speed of the pandemic underscores how deeply interconnected the world's population is. So we're not just connected, some are saying we're hyper-connected in terms of global social density. But at the same time that we're seeing this connectivity intensifying, we're also seeing a parallel trend of growing division. More border walls were built after 9/11 than in any time in human history. We're also seeing mental walls, political fragmentation, and hostility. Yet again, another insight from the virus is how it appears to have little regard for our walls, and it's taking advantage of our efforts to divide. So we have these insights about our world. I'm trying to get over here to get the move forward. The pandemic is also giving us some insights about us. We're social beings. One of the first and spontaneous behaviors under quarantine was to reach out and try to comfort each other. Here we see the residents of Wuhan chanting and giving encouragement. It's powerful. And another spontaneous behavior was to comfort and camaraderie, lifting spirits. Here we have music in Italy, in Spain, flutes in Brazil. We have delivering a rose via drone in Lebanon. We saw how people in Asia, Europe, North America, they gathered in the evenings. It's to thank the workers, but it provided an emotional relief and a sense of community. We saw how people, spontaneous behavior of people finding each other online to sing, dance, and play together. The virus revealed also that we're emotional beings. This photo was taken in mid-January It shows the fear and uncertainty of a potential new SARS. It was not known at the time. We saw the spontaneous sharing of emotional content, many going viral, like this touching photo of a father and son. With the rise of death toll, emotions of fear, sadness, and grief prevailed. And this is from the Amazon region. We see the pain of separation, a reunion of the pandemic, a reunion during the pandemic. And these were healthcare workers in Wuhan. If we look at these insights, they might be tempting to say, this all seems so obvious. Of course we know we're more connected than ever and on multiple ways. And who doesn't know that we're social and emotional beings? If all this is obvious, and I would agree it is, then why does public diplomacy seem so out of step? If you look at connectivity, how does this align with public diplomacy? Currently, public diplomacy's primary focus is on state and non-state actors, what Brian Hawkins called actorness. This focus on individual actors makes public diplomacy inherently competitive. It suggests a mindset of separateness. The intense soft power competition seems very much out of alignment with global connectivity. What about human emotion? Public diplomacy seems out of alignment with the need for human emotion and social comfort. The pandemic exposed how people around the globe spontaneously sought to meet this need. Yet public diplomacy and public diplomacy appears focused on the needs of the rational actor. And then what about public diplomacy? It seems out of alignment with even who we are as a species collectively and our collectively need to meet pressing goals. Evolutionary research is revealing that part of our survival as a species is based not on our individual strength, but on our collective capacity for collaboration. In a study of prehistoric diplomacy to present, Ivers Newman called diplomacy and our capacity to collaborate a hard-won, and I quote, a hard-won triumph of the species. Some scholars have labeled Homo sapiens hyper-collaborative, and the main reason that we survived while our much stronger cousin, the Neanderthal, disappeared. That evolutionary capacity to collaborate was abundantly displayed during the spontaneous behaviors during the pandemic. If we look at our wicked problems, we can think about the capacity to collaborate. And Ben Ziegler said, the growing gap between our evolutionary capacity to collaborate and the growth of wicked problems. They're separated there. Public diplomacy's most pressing challenging may not be soft power of nations individually, but how robust our capacity to collaborate is collectively and globally. So let me turn to the transformation. Let me return to the transformation. How is public diplomacy transforming? If we're at a time of great transformation, how can we transform? And I go back to the study of Newman, who identified a series of tipping points in the capacity collaboration. He suggested that with our digital technology and globalization, we're reaching a new tipping point. And I would agree. I believe that we're seeing the limits of public diplomacy that focus on actorsness, as well as the limits of actor-based functions, such as competitive advocacy. And what we're seeing is perhaps a transformation, not so much a transformation, but an expansion of public diplomacy from the individual level to the humanity level. And I wrote about humanity-centered diplomacy as the future of diplomacy, public diplomacy, in a special issue of the Hague Journal, and that was in 2019. And it focuses on the needs, interests, and goals of humanity. Castells has talked about this in terms of Eng talked about, and Serge talked about it, is public diplomacy and global public goods. Fitzpatrick's talked about it, and public diplomacy of the publics. And Holt has switched from nation branding to ranking good country, the good country projects. And I think this is what Dr. Snow was talking about in her essay in terms of the global. So if we're moving in this direction, how is public diplomacy can we change? And I want to talk here about the functions. And one function is global, is problem solving. We talk about multilateral negotiations and the research in that direction. We need more in terms of collaborative problem solving. This is a wide open field. Another area, and the second function is mediating identities. Public diplomacy has played a role in promoting awareness and pride in our separate identities. However, with global connectivity, we need to be creative and research ways of public diplomacy to create our collective human identity and humanity. A third function is being emotionally responsive to the public, what I would call empathetic public diplomacy. As we saw in the pandemic, we're emotional beings, and emotional well-being is critical for the health and stability of human societies. I think this is what Professor Moon was talking about when he said political stability. Part of that is linked to our emotional being. And people may ask, how can public diplomacy talk about emotion? And I would say, how can it not? How can it not? And a wonderful example comes from during the pandemic. When the seriousness of the pandemic was starting to hit in the British public, the British monarch, Queen Elizabeth, made a rare televised broadcast. And she spoke directly to the feelings of the people. She opened with empathy. She legitimized the public fears and pains of separation. And she spoke about the grief and then ended with a promise of hope. And so this was an example. More research, though, is needed in the role of public emotion and how public diplomacy can be more responsive. And thankfully, we have a Korean scholar who's written on this, Hee Sol, who wrote on empathy and public diplomacy. But this is a wide open field to explore. So in thinking about transforming our thinking, transforming our thinking, we need to expand in global problem solving, in how to enhance our capacity for cooperation, and how to become more emotionally responsive. And I want to say that South Korea has an opportunity to lead in this research. When I was preparing for this talk, I was struck by how many Korean scholars are just really pioneering the field in emotion and links to diplomacy, and emotion and links to public emotion. So these are wide open areas. And so I want to say it's been an honor to participate. It is forward-looking in its vision of address the needs, interests, and goals of humans and humanity. And so
Thank you so much, Dr. Zaharna. And I also want to remind everyone that you can ask a question. I'll be going to the questions after everybody, all the formal speakers, the Dr. Ihan and the two discussants have spoken, but we welcome questions on the chat bar on Zoom or on YouTube, and I will be receiving those questions as they come in. Otherwise, we'll have a panel discussion among ourselves, and I think to carry on the theme of connectivity and having this emotional connection, even online, we can do that. It helps when we hear more from each other and we get immediate feedback from you. So thank you so much. I was really riveted by that. And I would also encourage more of this type of research. It's so expanding as opposed to contracting in our thinking and about the human condition. So now I want to move to Dr. Ihan and welcome your presentation to our audience.
Hello.
Hi.
It's really great to be in the same panel with two great inspirations and friends, Dr. Snow and Dr. Zahana. Happy Thanksgiving to both of you and the rest of the audience, especially on YouTube. Today I will be connecting a few different lines of research, both in international relations theory, global governance research, as well as public diplomacy research, and I'll try to talk about Korea's public diplomacy in the age of COVID-19 along these lines. Let me see how this works. Okay, good. So I'll be beginning with the public diplomacy literature and how it sees status and reputation. Then I'll move to IR literature and I'll try to connect the two literatures. I'll then talk about a changing world order, although Professor Moon has already talked a great deal about it very nicely. And I'll talk about how public diplomacy is related to these topics. And then I'll talk about Korea's case. So in the public diplomacy research, oftentimes we see status, reputation, prestige being used almost interchangeably with a positive country image. However, in international relations research, that's not the case. Reputation could be positive. It could also have negative connotation. Indeed, in IR literature, prestige is often used for positive reputation, whereas reputation itself or status itself is not interchangeably used. And the level of analysis is often not spelled out explicitly in public diplomacy research, but implicitly it's the individual level, which then informs the public opinion. In international relations literature, status refers to an actor's position in a social hierarchy. It could also refer to membership in groups such as status as a major power or membership in G20, for example. Reputation, on the other hand, is a belief about a trait or behavioral tendency of an actor. Hence, it could be positive or negative. So, Dafoe et al. Urges researchers to ask these questions when talking about reputation. Reputation for what trait or behavior, in the eyes of whom, and for whom. In public diplomacy research, we don't pay too much attention to these questions, unfortunately. So it could be, reputation could be for resolve. It could be more militaristic in that sense. Reputation as a reliable ally. Reputation as a just hegemon. So it could mean too many different things, different than just having a good, positive country image, which has been the focus of public diplomacy research so far. And in the IR literature, different than the public diplomacy literature, the focus for the level of analysis is the state, sometimes a state as person, and to some extent, when the level is individuals, it's still foreign policy elites and leaders as individuals rather than masses. And continuing on how status and reputation is studied in IR, status is sought. So actors seek status, but it's only accorded by others. You cannot have status for your own. It must be accorded by others, and reputation is seized to that end. That's the status-seeking behavior. And in IR literature, as I said earlier, the focus is on elites. The masses are not seen as much important. But that's where we need the link between public diplomacy and IR literature, because interstate politics can be affected and indeed can be constituted by stakeholders at the grassroots level. So ordinary public opinion, or the masses public opinion, can inform foreign policy elites and leaders, and it can inform state policies, and not only in democracies but also in other places, because legitimacy of policies are needed, and legitimacy has roots in the grassroots. Ned Lebow talks about Greek philosophy and tries to understand how hegemons make sure that others comply with their role. And he talks about three most important universal motifs for it. First is fear, through military power. Second is appetite. So it could be through development cooperation, as in Marshall Plan after the Second World War. And the third is spirit, or we can call it legitimacy. And that would be relevant for public diplomacy. Dr. Snow, Dr. Zaharna, and many other colleagues have been talking about two-way symmetrical communication, its importance for public diplomacy and its importance for legitimacy. And we have heard about legitimacy both in Dr. Moon's presentation and Dr. Zaharna's presentation. Sorry, I've been showing you the wrong slide all along. Anyways, so public diplomacy can, so that was the slide I had to show you. Public diplomacy can back up interstate relations by helping or providing compliance with and legitimacy of an order, as well as legitimacy of foreign policies. And status, as I said earlier, status is in a hierarchy, in a social hierarchy. And this social hierarchy could be regional, it could be also global. And it could also be in specific issue areas, global issue areas, such as environment, human rights, gender equality, etc. And in these niche areas, we see that middle powers, especially recently, becoming more assertive to seek their status in these specific issue areas. And status research in IR literature often focuses on great powers, especially the greatest powers, hence polarity. So do we have unipolarity, bipolarity, multipolarity? Focuses only on great powers, and that's mainly because status research or status in general is largely based on material capabilities. And status dissatisfaction can even lead to wars between the countries, as in the case of Germany's status seeking, and it's not being accorded the status that it wants, hence status dissatisfaction and the war in the First World War. But it doesn't need to be that way, especially when we look at status in global issue areas. We see that middle powers seek status peacefully. They want to be authorities in specific issue areas, and they want to have authority mainly based on their principles, accepted norms of international or world society, such as humanitarianism. And both concepts come from the English School of IR, which I will emphasize later a little bit more, or sustaining a social order created by the hegemon of the current order, for example, the US-centric neoliberal international order in this case. Or if it's changing, then it would also, so the middle powers would also need to transform their policies to sustain the current order, the status quo. And group-conforming behavior can help buy status for countries that are not satisfied with their status. So it's not only about material capabilities. And in the case of Korea, the country has been quite confident in its material capabilities recently, especially after it surpassed North Korea in the 1970s in every dimension of political life, and following the end of the Cold War, the competition against communism or communist countries also was not an issue. Normalization followed with Russia, China, and other former socialist countries. Hence, South Korea put more emphasis on what Chon Do-han government referred to as omnidirectional diplomacy. So rather than just focusing on US and Japan, and to some extent North Korea, but it was seen as domestic politics, we should pay more attention to the world. Indeed, since then, since Chon Do-han government, under every government, we see that South Korea publishes diplomatic white papers every year. And almost since then, in almost every year's diplomatic white papers, we see that Korea's role and prestige in the international community is pronounced along with Korea's international contributions and Korea's multilateral diplomacy. The picture on the left is a snapshot from one of the Korea's diplomatic white papers. It's pretty much the same throughout the years. So the focus is on multilateral diplomacy and international development cooperation when it comes to Korea's status-seeking behavior. And this was pronounced much more assertively and to some extent aggressively under Im Yong-bak government, who focused too much on nation branding. He suggested that Korea is the world's 13th largest economy with some 20,000 USD in per capita income, but ranks only 33rd in the global brand index. And Dr. Zaharna have shown soft power 30 in that report. Also, Korea is does not have the same status that it deserves. According to CINC index published by Correlates of War, Korea is number 7 power in the world, which puts together military capabilities, population, economy, etc., all of them together. So Korea does not have the status that it deserves. Hence the idea, especially under Im Yong-bak government, was we must do something to move Korea from Korea discount to Korea premium, so that we can improve its reputation in a groundbreaking manner. Here again, reputation probably means positive prestige. And to win respect in the international community so that it will be on a par with the advanced countries, not just for its sake, it's instrumental. So status is instrumental and social. The time is now ripe for Korea to strive to become a more dignified country and to find its place among the ranks of advanced countries. So that's where we belong, not the small countries. The Public Diplomacy Act of 2016 also talks about image and prestige in the international community. And interestingly, Korea also have been using the term middle power, but compared to many other middle powers within G20 or otherwise, most of them would have leadership roles, great power roles within the region they are. For Australia, it's Oceania. For Turkey, it's the Middle East or the Islamic world to some extent. For Indonesia, it would be ASEAN. However, for South Korea, regional leadership is not an option. For Canada also, regional leadership is not an option. So for these kind of countries, status hierarchy is often sought in global issue areas rather than in the region. For India, the focus would be more on the region. For Australia, it could be in the region. For Turkey, it would definitely be in the region. But for Korea, global issue areas have more room for South Korea to seek status elevation. And coming to the idea of changing world order, we have unipolarity, and as pointed out in the previous discussion, it's changing. But it doesn't necessarily change to a bipolarity, as Professor Moon suggested, I think. Many global governance researchers talk about this. Rosenau talked about this probably 20 years, 30 years ago. Most recently, Amitav Acharya called this a multiplex world order, in which we have multiple authorities in different issue areas. So rather than just zooming out and looking at who are the great powers, we zoom in and look at specific issue areas. Who are the governors in specific issue areas, such as global health governance, global environmental governance, global internet governance, finance. So we look at these specific issue areas and we see there are different actors who are recognized as authorities in these issue areas. And it's been the case especially since 2008 financial crisis, which led to G20 becoming the main platform to discuss global governance issues. In the current order, US-led order, US has been taking care of many of appetite issues, providing global public goods in terms of volume. It's been providing the most. And the legitimacy of the US-led order came from multilateralism and permissiveness of even small powers to exist or to raise issues, to have their voices. In the current changing multiplex world order, then emerging powers would also need to show that they can also provide global public goods. They can share the burden so that they can satisfy the appetite of people around the globe. And also, legitimacy of the new order is very important, again, for the order to sustain. So how can we satisfy China and the US with the current changing world order? How can we satisfy the people so that there is no resistance against the current multiplex world order or changing order and compliance with it? And here I will talk about two aspects of public diplomacy in this changing world order in the age of COVID-19. One is promotional aspect and the other one is development cooperation aspect. For promotional, it could be done for domestic legitimacy of the national government. Second, international competitiveness and brilliance. As I said, the actors need authority to become important actors in specific global issue areas. And this authority can be based on different things. In the case of, for example, if a country shows its competitiveness and brilliance, it can have expertise-based authority or capabilities-based authority in the eyes of others, which would provide some sort of legitimacy to it. In terms of development cooperation, here I will refer to two frameworks. One is the English School of International Relations, which talks about international relations on three levels: international system, international society, and world society. In the international system, countries emphasize their national responsibilities. In the international society, countries emphasize international responsibilities. And in the world society, actors, not only countries, actors emphasize humanitarian responsibilities or responsibilities for the environment. And our great colleague James Pemmant talked a lot about the intersection between development and public diplomacy, and he came up with these three concepts of communication of, communication for, and communication about development. So communication of development cooperation is, what have we done? We have been helping other countries, we have been doing great. You should be thankful to us, we have been providing global public goods. It would provide the country that is doing it with expertise-based and capabilities-based authority, again, because of excellence, because of satisfying the appetite. However, communication and collaboration for development cooperation would focus more on the order, maintaining the order, so that countries need to understand they need to cooperate, otherwise they cannot solve the problem. So it would be very similar to what Dr. Zaharna called problem solving or mediating identities, the public diplomacy roles in this case. And it would provide countries or actors with institution-based authority, such as getting a position in the United Nations Security Council or getting a seat at G20 or newly emerging other platforms. Or again, principles-based authority because of the values of international society. And last but not least, communication about development cooperation. What kind of development cooperation discourse do we need? And it would be mainly based on values, principles. And I'll very briefly give examples from Korea. Korea has been doing promotional public diplomacy activities, sometimes for domestic legitimacy. So whenever you see Korean articles in Korean or videos in Korean, you would think the main target is Korean people. So that's just one example, rather than international audience. It's also doing promotional activities vis-a-vis other countries. Minister of Trade, Industry and Energy said international standardization of K-quarantine model will not only raise our country's global status, but it will also help us lead in the global market. And this was also pointed out by Professor Moon earlier. KF president recently wrote, and he delivered a couple of speeches to that end, that there is a Korean model which competes with the China model regarding COVID-19 in the world. And this will help South Korea to become one of the advanced nations in the world. And there has been promotional campaigns such as Trust to that end. And South Korea has been publishing many reports, doing many webinars to show South Korea's success story. So lots of budget also spent to that end. But that's not all. And Korea has been successful because many of the news articles, Twitter posts, SNS posts have been quite positive about South Korea. So South Korea's brilliance was kind of accepted by others. However, that was not all. South Korea also have been sending medical equipments to support many other places, including 109 countries. And it pledged 100 million USD to WHO, and Korea promised to increase, the current government promised to increase its ODA budget by 19% next year. So that was communication of development. And communication for development, South Korea always wants multilateral solutions to these problems, and G20 is often shown as the platform to discuss these issues. And recently, South Korea led the establishment of groups of friends on health issues at UN, WHO, and UNESCO, and South Korea is the co-chair in all of these platforms. Typical middle power behavior, seeking multilateralism and collaboration with others, especially in development cooperation field. And communication for development also, there has been a lot of public-private health cooperation or promotion to that end recently. However, when it comes to communication about development cooperation, we don't see as much because so far we don't have much chance to come up with strategies. So far it's been reactive. But communication about development requires proactive strategies. So that would be the next stage. Indeed, Anna Park, South Korea's previous former ambassador for public diplomacy, current ambassador to London, she gave a speech at University of Southern California and later published a chapter in Dr. Snow's book and talking about how South Korea is now moving to South Korea is currently at public diplomacy 2.0, but not public diplomacy 3.0, but it's slightly getting there. And I think what she is referring to is communication about development cooperation, humanitarian responsibilities more than national or international responsibilities. Hence, this might help joining hands with the world society, the people of the world, very much like Canada has been doing with ICBL and many other non-state actors. That would be all. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Ihan. There's so much food for thought here, and we have two more speakers, actually discussants. I'm going to call on Samo Lee first, and then we'll go to Anna K. DuPont, and then open it up. I've already got a few questions that have come in for the last part of our panel. So is Anselmo Lee online?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this excellent panel. My name is Anselmo Lee. I've been teaching Kyung University about human rights, global governance, recently the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And also I've been practicing so-called public diplomacy as civil society because I've been engaged in the civil society last 30 years. And also recently I started serving the KOICA, Korea Internet Cooperation Agency, as a non-executive board member. As many said, ODA can play an important role. I was listening to excellent presentation this morning, two keynote and also the thematic presentation from that perspective, civil society and also the ODA. Let me share my thoughts or response to presentation. The 3 points. Number one is there are a lot of concepts and also definition about public diplomacy in the age of COVID-19. And traditionally, as Ian said, we have international relations, foreign relations, public. But at the same time, from my own perspective and experience, I think we need to also develop a new way of understanding the public diplomacy from civil society, which means from civil society in Asia, people don't use the term public diplomacy. It's too public, that means too governmental. So people prefer civic diplomacy or citizen diplomacy. For instance, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they are promoting citizens diplomacy. That means citizens they are the main actors of the public diplomacy. So in that sense, I think we need to develop more sophisticated terminologies to describe the emerging situation and trends. Second point is about COVID-19. Among the many definitions about public diplomacy, one of my favorite is public diplomacy in global public good, GPG. I think that's very relevant for especially the time of the COVID-19 because vaccine, Professor Moon mentioned about vaccine nationalism. So vaccine obviously is a global public good. The question is how public diplomacy can deal with this, the vaccine as a global public good. I think this is our common challenge in the time of the COVID-19 crisis. But unfortunately, I'm speaking from Korea, so my colleague Anna, she will speak from the US as a diplomat. From my point of view, because of Corona, as our keynote speaker, Jahana described, there are some good things and not so positive things, So because of coronavirus, people are more closely united and practicing solidarity, different ways, singing, dancing, very emotional ways. At the same time, there's also the xenophobia and also hate speech and racism. So we have two phases of coronavirus. So how we can address those dark side of the coronavirus from public diplomacy point of view? Let me suggest a few things. Traditionally, for me, public diplomacy is like a part of foreign policy to increase attractiveness, the image, improve the image of the nations. I think we need to transform this stereotyping understanding of public diplomacy from nationalistic to global, which means public diplomacy should be part of global governance, not international relations, foreign affairs. That means I think we need to create a common agenda for community of public diplomacy, global agenda. For instance, this year 2020 was the 75th anniversary of UN. The UN General Assembly adopted the declaration, and also we have the SDG 2030 agenda 5 years ago, 2015. But luckily, Joe Biden, in his acceptance speech, he said, United States, we will put more effort on multilateralism. At the same time, return to Paris the climate, which is really welcome news. So I'm very curious whether U.S. can play the leading role in the 2030 agenda, which is long term, and which can be the common agenda for all the communities of public diplomacy. And lastly, SDG target 4.7, which talks about global citizenship education. I think we need to really build global citizen education to build global citizens who can play the key role in public diplomacy, beyond the national interest. So in that sense, let's build up the global agenda, and then we can play the role as the United States, Korea, and Asia, and all the neighboring countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Anna K. DuPont, if you'd like to speak now, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snow. Thank you to the KAPD and Professor Cho for the invitation and all the esteemed panelists. As a practitioner of public diplomacy, today is really a welcome chance to reflect on the events basically of this year. As you know, COVID-19 hit Korea early. With the exception of my colleagues at the U.S. mission to China, those of us in Korea were sort of the first to deal with what are the implications for the virus, practically speaking, for public diplomacy. And I can assure you, as we were repatriating American exchange participants or working with our counterparts at the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to help Korean exchange participants in the U.S. return to Korea or canceling any number of programs, we were not doing so thinking about the IR literature or the other larger implications of this virus. So today is really a chance to think about that. And I do think that since then, as this virus has continued, and I don't think this is unique to U.S. diplomats, I think this is probably true of public diplomacy practitioners around the world, we really do have to think about and self-reflect what does this mean for us going forward. So Professor Zaharna asked a question via Professor Snow's essay of what is our mission of public diplomacy. And the fact is that that's a pretty easy question to answer from the U.S. perspective. Our mission remains, as it always is, supporting a strong U.S.-Korea alliance, working towards a free and open Indo-Pacific, facilitating free and fair trade, et cetera, et cetera. But in a COVID-19 context, what that looks like is quite different. And I think what we're finding here with myself and my colleagues is pre-COVID-19, we spent a lot of time, if we think about public diplomacy as a sort of continuum of understanding our audiences and developing plans and managing effectively and then learning and adapting, whereas we spent a lot of time managing effectively and developing plans, now is a time to understand audiences and to learn and adapt. And a day like today is certainly a part of that. So there were a few things that I wanted to respond to in the excellent presentations and the keynotes this morning, just to keep the discussion going. And one is this idea of the emotional aspect of public diplomacy, which I fully agree with. We need the whole triangle, right? We need the logos, the pathos, the ethos. But the fact is, and today illustrates that in this context, we're spending a lot more time online. We're doing a lot more diplomacy via screens. I had a great chat with Professor Lee during the coffee break, and we'll come away with a different relationship with him than I'll be able to with some of my colleagues on the screen. So I still think maybe something fundamental is missing when we're removed from our physical environment in public diplomacy. That sort of last 3 feet of Edward Murrow. And also we see in polling around the world that one of the major factors in people having a positive view of the United States is whether or not they've met and interacted with an American. So in a context where that's not as possible, how do we sort of balance the physical and digital in our quest for more emotional public diplomacy or more humanist public diplomacy going forward? And then the second question that came to mind, and it's as the keynotes this morning also noted, COVID-19 has sort of laid bare the necessity of multilateralism and cooperation, though it has not been the reality of addressing this virus on a global level. And so part of that may have to do with, as Professor Moon said this morning, resurgent nationalisms or publics with decreasing appetites for multilateralist actions. So I wonder how we square, again, this need for a cooperative and humanist public diplomacy with that phenomenon worldwide. So I don't have great answers, but I remain interested in the discussion, and thank you all again for having me today.
And talk about more collaborative approaches. What do you think, Dr. Ihan?
Make sure you're not mute.
Oh, sorry. The camera angle is not showing me, but I guess you hear me.
Yes, we do.
I think if I talk too much about this, it won't be very pleasant because I feel like I'm the definition police for public diplomacy because of a couple of articles I've written about it. But if I may, I think it also has something to do with the Korean definition of public diplomacy. Konggong for public has this connotation of public sector, hence belonging to the government. So many people calling for a civil society aspect of public diplomacy. But I think diplomacy belongs more to the government than the word public in public diplomacy. So why do we need to call what the civil society does civil diplomacy or something like that? Why not just call it civil society's participation in global governance? Why does it have to be diplomacy? So, and as Anna also pointed out, many of the practitioners are doers. They don't really care about definitions anyway. So definitions are not that important. And we see the importance of non-state actors and individuals in specific global governance issue areas anyways. So regardless of calling it public diplomacy or not, they are part of the equation now. And Dr. Zahan also brought Manuel Castell's ideas about kind of radical perspective of public diplomacy, diplomacy being done by the public. So again, regardless of it being called diplomacy or not, they are definitely part of the equation and they would definitely remain as such.
I want to go to a question. Global publics, what about global tourism? Tourism is an instrument of public diplomacy, and now due to COVID-19, precipitous drop. April. How might tourism persons post-COVID would like to said, okay, Dr. Zaharna.
You know, I love that question. And one of the things that I've seen with the pandemic is how incredibly creative and innovative people are. And I was just thinking in terms of the online teaching, things that have just blows my mind away. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be virtual tourism. It's kind of like a stopgap between physically being able to go, that there will be a virtual tourism that will generate interest that will kind of fill that space of not actually being there, but virtually being there. I've just seen just very, very creative stuff being happening. And I wouldn't be surprised if like you can just check in and just have a virtual experience in the country. I think it would just be absolutely fascinating.
Right. On the other hand, though, the physical distance, the lack of the face-to-face communication is there, and that's what Anna had mentioned as well. It's I feel like I'm suffering a bit that I'm not in the room with everybody else.
That is just so incredibly. What's fascinating, and I could say to Anna. There's neuroscience research that's come out that it's that whole thing of physically being there, we emotionally connect, the body connects, and there's a whole branch of research that's out there. So it's absolutely critical. But at the same time, people fall in love on the internet, they date, they're doing all kinds of things, and we're seeing these emojis, and the digital environment is incredibly emotional. That's what's fascinating there. So it's not either or, but we'll get through the pandemic, but we're going to find all kinds of crazy stuff that's going to happen. Yeah, I'm fascinated by it.
Would any of the discussants or Dr. Ihan want to weigh in? I've got another question, but...
If I may shortly add, Dr. Zaharna has been talking about relational public diplomacy for so long, and it's very critical for sustainable public diplomacy in the long term. I just hope that this pandemic does not remain with us for very long, that otherwise, currently, public diplomacy activities focus more on the informational end rather than the relational end. I hope that it won't remain too long, that we can go back to the relational.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you there. The other question from Zoom is this concept of collaborative and empathetic PD. It's taking us back to the United States with the new U.S. administration. We've been reading a lot of articles about a change, a lean perhaps toward that direction as we're getting to know the new cabinet and leadership in place. So the questioner says Biden certainly has stressed empathy throughout the campaign and more U.S. involvement in world affairs. So could that then have a linkage to what we do in public diplomacy? Is this sort of the beginning of renewing American soft power? I think most of us would probably agree it is, given where we were for 4 years. But I just wanted you all to address that. I'd like to see us talk about what other countries are doing too, but we've been talking about the American, Pax Americana earlier in the morning, and we certainly are going to rely here in Japan and Korea and many other parts of the world on this U.S. leadership that seems to be more multilateral in its direction. So where do we go then with the collaborative and empathetic PD? And that's for anybody.
If I can begin, I think this is a question not only about the current pandemic, it's more about the Trump administration altogether. And
Right.
This is not the first time we are seeing something like this. We had the second Bush era,
Yes.
where American global image, so-called global image, suffered a lot. But it wasn't very difficult for Obama administration to kind of recover it. Despite many criticisms domestically, Obama was loved globally. And it's quite apparent in many of the public opinion polls done by Pew Research. And it's done again, and it will be up to the Biden administration to recover it. And I don't think it would be a huge problem if, as long as the U.S. continues to play the leadership duties and not shirk those duties. And it would have something to do with the legitimacy again, being part of multilateralism, respecting others, especially their self-esteem, and public diplomacy shouldn't need to go back to 1970s, 1980s Cold War public diplomacy. It has been evolving, so it can just continue to evolve by taking into account the interests of the public in other countries and listening to them.
There was a follow-up to that question, which is, can the U.S. pursue a more collaborative PD without more directly engaging China, perhaps in a different way altogether? Sort of the polarity dilemma here, that China is always a looming question in relationship to talking about everything that we've been discussing this morning. So what role then for U.S.-China versus maybe more multilateral collaboration? We've seen China move toward wanting to join the TPP, and that's gotten a lot of debate online about China taking advantage of perhaps what's seen as a weaker administration. I mean, to your point about emotion, Dr. Zaharna, don't we often sort of equate being emotional and empathetic as weaker? And we often assign those values and characteristics more to women, for instance, and as not really the rational actor leadership that we're looking for. So
I don't see it as weaker. And you know who I think about whenever when I was doing my book, Harold Saunders, Ambassador Harold Saunders, he was the advisor to 5 presidents. And I was trying to get him to write a chapter for the book. And I was talking about relationships. And I called it a girly term. He exploded. He just exploded. And because he worked on the shuttles with Kissinger and the Arab and Israeli negotiations, and then also Russia. And he said, don't you ever call it a girly term, because this is what the global dynamics is about. And so I just went off on a tangent there. But, that's what I was going to say. Emotion is, you can say it is the weak, maybe saying weaker, but what it's now coming out, the World Economic Forum just put out, they put out the top skills that they're looking for, or what's going to be driving the economies and for the 4th technological revolution. And the computers can do some things, but they can't do what humans do. and that's empathy, emotional intelligence, humility, and all of these sound like very weak, but these are the skills that are going to be in demand because they're the things that computers cannot do. And so I was just going to say another thing about this multipolar and bipolar and that. The climate change, the one in Paris, was not done by the leadership of big leaders. It was driven by the island nations. And then they put together this coalition and bringing in governments and bringing in corporations. And so we talk about these big leaders, but in a humanity-centered, it's going to be coming from all of the players.
Excellent. That was actually a setup question, just for you to explain the power and that, in fact, the emotional intelligence is a strength. So I wanted to ask a question of getting back to problem solving and mediating identities in the context of Korea and the middle powers. When you read a lot of the literature, and there's so much coming from the Korean scholars that we value so much. I love the language of it because it's driven by geography in part, but it is this opportunity for Korea. So how might Korea better promote this middle way balance, if you will? I think balanced approach to get away just from the big powers is an important one. How would Korea go about this? And I think it's a good way to sort of bring our panel to a conclusion. We have about 6-7 minutes yet to go. So who would like to address that? And maybe we could have one more question online, possibly. So Korea's specific leadership and as a middle power related to all of these characteristics, where we can raise the visibility of this model, because the model of Korea has been raised so much vis-a-vis COVID, but not so much vis-a-vis this notion of promoting peace and the PD 3.0 and really getting beyond the competitive identities, but searching for that peaceful middle way.
I think for countries like South Korea, middle powers, the reason why they focus on niche areas in global governance is because they don't have the material capabilities to compete with the regional or global great powers. So in order to avoid, for example, making a choice between China and the US, the best way is finding a way not to make a choice. And it's possibly avoiding another Cold War. And avoiding another Cold War would mean leading the direction of the change. Rather than changing from unipolarity to bipolarity, as I said earlier, maybe a global governance issue area focused multiplex world order would be the best option for any of the middle powers. Because otherwise they'll have to choose between the two sides. And countries like Korea is at the center of this tension, because Korea is right next to China. It's not like Russia, because at that time it was the European countries like Greece and Turkey that were at the border with Soviet Union. But now it will be South Korea that will feel the tension the most. So the best way would be avoiding it, I guess.
Dr. Lee, yes, thank you.
I think that's a very interesting question. From being Korea as a Korean, I think I want to use two keywords. One is a youthquake, which was one of the keyword of the year a few years ago. Youth earthquake, youth, because we see the role of youth in the American election, Black Lives Matters, and also election, and also in Korea today, and also in Asia, Hong Kong, Thailand, here and there. At the same time, dynamite Dynamite is the name of song, the BTS this year. They got the Grammy Award, nomination a few days ago. I think the culture of youth power, the power of youth culture through this music, not because of this fancy music, but the message conveyed in this Dynamite, positive. I think, as Jana said, very emotional because, there is also another word, 준비, After a few hours of the Zoom conversation training, become zombie, that means the 준비, But very surprisingly, I've been, many Zoom meetings like you, but after many, months, the conversation, we become too emotionally, not zombie, but very attached to each other, It's a very strange experience, This is a real face-to-face meeting, even more the real face-to-face meetings. I think there's a lot of potential, Youth, culture, these are digital, That they can be, I think, the one of the transformational, the source of the public diplomacy for global public good. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yes, Dr. Zaharna.
I want to say for South Korea, I want to go to Dr. Ayan when he talked about reputation. I think that's absolutely critical as just being a model for other countries and a bridge. And I'm thinking about Professor Moon when he talked about principled. And that is incredibly powerful. Just the integrity and what it's demonstrated during COVID. So I think there's a power in that of when you talk about what role is just that principled reputation. And I think there's something to that to really explore and push.
Well, I have one final question, and it's regarding a domestic issue, providing a vaccine to North Korea. When it comes to the possibility of a vaccine being made available to North Korea, a majority of domestic groups in South Korea now seem to be hesitant to giving the vaccine to North Korea. Is there any room for public diplomacy to engage on this situation in the Koreas, if I'm understanding that, or in South Korea? What can be the role of government or civil society implementing public diplomacy in this or other situations where domestic consensus hasn't been met yet? Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I think we're all anticipating a vaccine. So this is addressing the possibility of helping provide this to North Korea. I don't know if anybody wants to take that on. We just have a minute to go in our session.
Maybe since it's about North Korea, maybe I can share my thought, because this is also what Professor Moon said in his last presentation, the diplomacy based on national consensus, because the vaccine to North Korea issue was very polemic because not everybody agree, because of political circumstances these days, nuclear issues and so on. But the question is how to frame the vaccine. Vaccine is a humanitarian issue, but people want to politicize vaccine as a weapons or national secret and so on. I think as a public diplomacy, I believe the people agree if this is a humanitarian issue, but now unfortunately it becomes a political issue. So I think we have to be a little bit, cautious and also find a way, how to appeal to the people's general public in terms of the, as you said, the humanity-based approach to public diplomacy. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We're about to wrap it up. If anybody has any final remarks, otherwise, I just want to leave us on a positive note and tell you that when I worked at the U.S. Information Agency in the early to mid-90s during Clinton's first term, we could not at that time even release the URL for USIA to an American who happened to call the agency. Such was this separation, this demarcation line between our target, the global publics versus domestic publics. So, and in terms of actors, the actors in public diplomacy were almost entirely seen as government and public servants. So we have opened up really the world for research and practitioner work, and also for youth exchange. We did have a youth exchange program, but we have really made a lot of progress. And so I just want to thank you all for all of the thinking that you have me doing right now related to this topic. It was really quite stimulating, and we're just the first panel, so we've got a lot more to come. So again, thank you, and thank you to KAPD and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I guess it's
you.
lunchtime now.
Okay.